I'm delighted that we have joining us today Michael Jones-Correa, who is Professor of Government at Cornell University. He's a leading scholar of immigration, ethnicity, and politics, whose research has been funded by many of the major foundations and research institutes, among them Russell Sage Foundation, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics at Princeton. He is the author or co-author of 3 books, most recently Latinos in the New Millennium, which was published by Cambridge in 2012, as well as Latino Lives in America, Making It Home, published in 2010. The book that in many respects made his reputation, really in a very important study of urban politics between 2 nations, The Political Predicament of Latinos in New York City, which was published by Cornell in 2008. He has also been involved with the Russell Sage Foundation in various ways, including being the team leader for their theme project recently on immigration, settlement, immigration, and membership. He's also served on the committee on the redesign of the U.S. naturalization test for the National Academy of Sciences. He was elected vice president of the American Political Science Association and was appointed in 2010 to the American National Election Studies Board of Overseers. He's currently working on several projects, including an analysis of the Latino National Survey, a project on suburbanization and ethnic diversity, and a project on intergroup contacts and perceptions and their impact on civic participation among native-born residents and immigrants in Atlanta and Philadelphia, which is part of which is the subject for this afternoon's presentation on brotherly love, diversity, community trust, and civic engagement among immigrant and native-born Philadelphians. Thank you, Michael.
Great. Thank you. Thanks to Tom for a very thorough bio. It's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to be in Philadelphia, and to have the chance for this opportunity for feedback from this room full of Philadelphians on this project that's still in its early stages. And I just want to start off by saying 2 things. One, that this is a much better title as the result of Tom's suggestion, because he made it, sort of punchier. And second, that the title is a lie, because I'm actually going to be talking about Atlanta as well as Philadelphia, although the bulk of the talk will be about Philadelphia. So, this is part of a large research project with 4 collaborators. And I'm the minority in this group. I'm the only political scientist. There are 2 sociologists and social psychologists. And this began as an endeavor by the Russell Sage Foundation. They had 2 working groups, one on immigration, one on social psychology, cultural contact. And they said, we have this great idea. We're just going to put these 2 groups together and make them one, to get the psychologists talking to the people who were doing immigration. And then they encouraged working groups to emerge from this, this big group of people they put together. And this project is the direct result of this. So you can kind of see, you will see as I talk, how the social psychology, the sociology, and the political science all come together in this project. So I'm going to start by talking about the research questions, then about this Philadelphia-Atlanta survey, a little bit about how we went about thinking about the selection of the site, the groups, how we think about status markers in institutional spaces, talk a bit about the survey, the pilot survey, which was from last summer, and then some preliminary conclusions from the larger Atlanta-Philadelphia survey, and then where we're headed. So, with that. So the starting point for this project is contact theory. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. It's the this is the social psychology element. So this as groups come together, they come into contact. This contact, particularly if it's across groups of equal social status, will lead to development of trust, and that's where the social psychologists kind of end. So they're interested in trust. The sociologists and myself, we're certainly interested in the development of trust, but equally interested in how trust plays out, so where trust leads. So the part that we'll talk a bit about today toward the end is how then trust then shapes civic engagement. I should also note that political scientists completely differ in approach from the social psychologists. So we think that contact, when groups come into contact, this leads to heightened threat and conflict. So political scientists almost never use this approach to contact and contact theory in the way that social psychologists do. So for us, it's all about conflict. And for the social psychologists, they're very optimistic. So they think that contact leads to this sort of improvement of relations under certain kinds of conditions. And in a sense, that's what this project is about and what we're trying to look into further. So what happens when groups come into contact? And so this social contact theory, a lot of it is about blacks and whites and native-born blacks and whites. So it comes out of this literature from the 1960s, and they're not really interested in immigration. So we have this kind of changing demographics in the country, and all of a sudden you have multiple groups interacting with one another, and sort of opens up this whole new set of questions about how does contact take place, and what do different groups think of one another. So there's also a lot of disagreement about what contact actually means. So we don't know whether it means one-time interactions, friendly interactions, interactions at work. So part again, what this project does is try to disentangle or create a more nuanced view of what we mean by contact. We don't really have a lot of sense of what contact, the effects of contact in different social spaces. So there's quite a lot of work on workplaces and neighborhood, much less on public spaces, Elijah Anderson's work here at Penn. And we're also interested in the way that status markers play out in how people evaluate one another along different dimensions of status, moving beyond socioeconomic status. So when again, sociologists, political scientists, the way they think about status is usually about class, and secondarily about race. And what we're doing in this project is looking as well at religion, language, accent, legal status, so citizen, non-citizen, undocumented, and skin tone. So this is a self-evaluated measure. So we want to know what this intergroup contact looks like across immigrants and native-born, and how these patterns of contact differ across different social spaces, and then how people evaluate one another in these social spaces along different status dimensions, and then how this all shapes trust, and then how trust then shapes civic engagement. So there are a lot of moving parts in this project, and you can kind of see how complicated a survey might get if you're trying to get at these different dimensions in these different social spaces across these different groups in these two cities. So these questions about contact, and then thinking about contact occurring in different spaces and people evaluating one another across different dimensions, led us to thinking about picking two groups. We wanted to pick a high status group and a low status group in the kind of conventional way that say sociologists would think about high and low status, just looking at socioeconomic status. So we think about two immigrant groups where Mexican immigrants would be the kind of quintessential low status group, and South Asian Indian immigrants would be the, again, quintessential high status group. So South Asian Indians, many of them come to the United States with college degrees, sometimes with professional degrees. They're occupying this niche in the job market as medical professionals or as programmers, many of them. And Mexican immigrants, of course, coming in with a lower education and filling in this kind of working class position. And then looking as well at the two native-born groups, whites and blacks. So once we started off with this question about contact And then we picked the two groups we were interested in looking at. This led us to a set of hypotheses about what would happen. So, you know, we still think that socioeconomic status will matter. It's just that we think that these other things will matter too. So we thought, well, you know, citizenship is going to matter, legal status is going to matter, and skin tone and how people evaluate skin tone will probably have an effect. Language ability and probably religion. I'm particularly interested in the Asian Indian immigrants because on some dimensions of status, they're high status, but on other dimensions, you could conceivably argue that they're low status. So skin tone, for instance, or religion. So the way that people evaluate religion, you know, lots of people think this is a Christian country, and a lot of Indian immigrants, of course, are not Christian. So on those dimensions, they might be considered low status, and Mexican immigrants might be considered at least closer to the median. They might be considered closer to high status. They're Christian, perhaps not as dark, but of course there's questions about legal status for some of the immigrant Mexicans. So the idea here is that these two groups are going to differ along these different dimensions of status, and it's going to play out differently for the two groups. Again, there's a lot written about workplaces and neighborhoods, but not as much about public spaces, and we're very interested in how these interactions play out in public spaces, so restaurants, parks, libraries. So we have a set of questions in the survey, but as I'll talk about a little bit, we're going to move beyond the survey to look at and conduct field work in these two metro areas. Right. So this then leads us to our two metro areas. So there are about 10 metro areas in the US that have these two immigrant groups as significant populations. I think we had a cutoff of maybe 50,000. And so it could have been Dallas, we could have picked Boston. We ended up picking Atlanta and Philadelphia. So in both of these metro areas, South Asian Indians and Mexican immigrants are the two largest foreign-born groups. They have a similar kind of trajectory in both of these metro areas. They're arriving at more or less the same time. Both of these metro areas, well, in Philadelphia's case, there was a big gap in the sort of history of immigration before sort of immigration began building up again and picking up again in the 1980s. And Atlanta had an even larger gap, but a similar kind of trajectory in the 1980s where sort of immigration began arriving in greater numbers to the Atlanta area. So the initial part of this project are these randomized telephone surveys. We did a pilot last summer in Philadelphia alone. It was a 20-minute survey, so it had all the contact, or well, many of the contact questions, the different spaces, different social statuses. It didn't have any of the civic engagement questions. And then we went back into the field this summer and did a survey that was double the length with a much larger group of people. So we had 2,000 people, so 1,000 in each of the metro areas, 250 for each group. And so I'll talk a little bit about this. So when I was originally agreed to do this, I thought, oh, I'm going to have plenty of time. You know, I'll analyze all the data. So clearly that did not happen. But I did. We've done some work on this, on the newer data. So I'll talk first about the older data and then about the newer data in the course of this talk. So I don't have to say very much about Philadelphia. You're all from Philadelphia. So I just want to say that one of the things that interests us is Philadelphia's politics. So this is a strong mayor, ward-based system. It's very different from Atlanta. Both Atlanta and Philadelphia have this kind of black-white binary. So in some sense, the underlying history of race relations in both cities, although one is northern, one is southern, is not dissimilar. And you're getting this massive suburbanization in general, but also of immigrants in both these metro areas. And in the Philadelphia area where immigrants are more dispersed than blacks. So this is just going to show you this quickly. This is the the kind of trends for the Philadelphia area in migration, and you can kind of see, lots of immigrants, and growing very quickly. So there's really this kind of dramatic increase in the numbers of immigrants, again, beginning the 1990s, but really taking off late 1990s, 2000s. So you'll live here, you'll notice this. There's a very marked change in Philadelphia over the last 15, 20 years. So this kind of shows where the foreign-born are living. This is, of course, Philadelphia. And yes, so you can kind of see the concentrations. This is Upper Darby. We're kind of around here, and we'll talk a bit more about this. But we have the same kind of clustering in Atlanta. So Atlanta, again, similar kind of rapid increase in immigrants. The same kind of suburbanization. Very different kind of political structure. And immigrants are dispersed, but so are blacks. So, and in Atlanta, in the Atlanta metro area, there's a much bigger black suburbanization than in Philadelphia. And it's a middle-class black suburbanization. It's a very different kind of pattern. This is what Atlanta looks like. This is the city of Atlanta. There's this corridor going northeast. It's an amazing, if you guys ever get to Atlanta, I'll show you some pictures, but it's really pretty amazing. And this is DeKalb County. This is also part of DeKalb. And there's this is Cobb County. There's another corridor off that way and a little bit here to the south. So this is the same kind of thing, just with little dots. And Stone Mountain. So I'm just going to run you. This is for so the modern Ku Klux Klan began in DeKalb County, and so there's this massive granite dome that was carved with. This is where the Ku Klux Klan began. Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, Lee. I think it's just three of them, right? Yes, those are the three. And this is outside. It's a short drive from Atlanta. So that part of Atlanta, DeKalb County, is now majority African American. And I find this deeply ironic that so this is a big green park outside Atlanta, and it's where middle-class African-American families go picnic in the summer. So they're sitting underneath the shadow of this mountain with the heroes of the Confederacy up above, and it's a middle-class, black neighborhood. So I think this is great. So the strip malls, and it's just it's the land of strip malls, and again the strip malls have lots and lots of immigrant businesses. So you can see this is mostly Korean. Here's the Taqueria Michoacan, and just drive by. There's like immigrant businesses scattered everywhere. And then you get this. So you're driving along sort of suburban Atlanta. This is not that far from Stone Mountain. It's about halfway there. And there's this enormous Hindu temple. It's Gujarati, and I've never seen quite anything quite like it. There's nothing like this in Philadelphia, by the way. It's just there's nothing comparable. This thing takes up like the equivalent, I don't know, like 5 square blocks. It's really, really huge and amazing. So. This is in suburban Atlanta. And just wanted to point, this is the menu inside their cafeteria. And what I love about this menu is that it's got everything. It's got Manchurian stuff, Chinese stuff, cheese pizza, quesadillas, nachos, and then of course some Indian stuff thrown in too. And this is kind of Atlanta. So it's like everything sort of mashed together. This is an Indian-owned gas station with Mexican workers standing outside. And we had conversations with a police chief who said that they'd begun cracking down on these day laborers standing outside of these gasoline stations. And that the Indian owners, a lot of them are Indian owned, had gotten together to meet with the police chief to tell them that they wanted them to back off. So we thought there's some interesting interactions taking place in Atlanta between the Indian immigrants and the Mexican immigrants and the ways that they come together in interacting with authorities like police. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to switch back now to just talking about Philadelphia. This is the pilot study conducted last year. Again, this is a phone survey, randomized, 4 groups, and this is going to talk a little bit about contact. So, just kind of a preview. People are more isolated in neighborhoods. Mexicans are really socially isolated. So this comes across all the data. They're isolated from every other group, including their own group, and they're also the least trusting. So here's Mexicans, percent indicating no friends. So no friends who are black, no friends who are Indian. So you get high percentages saying no friends who are black, no friends who are Indian. Blacks saying they have no friends. Whoops. Uh-oh. There we go. Yes, no friends who are Indian, no friends who are Mexican, and whites saying they have no friends who are Mexican. So there's more interaction, which you might expect, sort of in the smaller group to the larger group, but there's not a lot of friendship going on here, particularly between the 2 immigrant groups, with blacks in the 2 immigrant groups. And here's what work interactions look like. Again, between the 2 immigrant groups, it's Mexicans and Indians. So Indians have more interaction across the 4 groups than Mexicans do. And this is neighborhood interactions. You can begin to see that Mexicans and Indians really don't overlap in their neighborhood spaces. And the numbers here, percentages indicating never, are much higher than they are for either friendship or for workspaces. So neighborhoods are more residentially isolated. People are more residentially isolated in neighborhoods than they are in workplaces. That's not so surprising. So this is about friendly contact. So this is blacks, this is whites. So whites indicate much more friendly contact across the 4 groups than African Americans do. Both of them indicate fairly friendly contact with Mexicans in their neighborhoods, but the numbers are pretty strikingly different. This is immigrants' perceptions of friendly contact, again with the blue being Mexican, Indian being the yellow. And again, this is a pattern that's repeated across all the data, where Indian immigrants are much more optimistic. They're much more, they generally perceive friendlier contact in every social arena with everyone. And Mexican immigrants have much more kind of pessimistic readings of their social contact across social arenas. So trust in Mexican immigrants. So there are a couple of things that are, generally, whites, the groups are generally pretty optimistic. African Americans of the native born are significantly less optimistic about their levels of trust, or less positive, I should say, than whites. There's about 10% of blacks who say they never trust Mexicans. But the other interesting thing is that Mexicans themselves also report fairly high percentages of people saying that they rarely trust other Mexicans. And they're the only group for which this is true. So you can see that Indians, for instance, who are talking about other Indians, there's no one who says they never trust another Indian immigrant, and very few say rarely. The Mexican immigrants, there's a huge percentage who say they never trust Indian immigrants. And I think that's quite interesting. So there's very little contact between the Indian immigrants and the Mexican immigrants in Philadelphia, and there's very little trust, at least from the Mexican side to the Indian side. This is trust in African Americans. Whites are very positive, Indians are very positive, Mexicans very negative. So Again, this is not an unusual pattern in the responses for Mexican immigrants, but they're really quite negative about contacts with African Americans. Contact with native-born whites, you can see the difference here. Mexicans are much more positive about their contacts with whites than they are about their contacts with blacks. And generally, all the groups are fairly positive about their contact with whites, including African Americans. Never trust is just another version of what was kind of seen, where Mexican immigrants are saying that they, fairly high percentages saying that they never trust blacks. This is that they never trust Indian immigrants. This is that they never trust whites. And you can kind of see here where, again, this is part of the pattern of Mexican immigrants being the most socially isolated and the least trusting across all the groups. So we have different levels of contact across social spaces. And then the smaller groups report more contact than the bigger groups do. It's kind of, you'd kind of expect that. There's a lot of contact across, there isn't a lot of contact, sorry. There isn't a lot of contact, again, across the two groups, particularly in neighborhoods. And Mexican immigrants, of course, are very, very isolated and not very trusting. So one of the things that struck us as we were looking at this pilot data, looking at discrimination, is that legal status and religion didn't matter very much. So and thinking about how these different statuses play out, so we've done some modeling, and religion matters a bit for the Indian immigrants, but you'll see they're not huge numbers. And language and accent play out a lot more, and so does racial discrimination. And surprisingly, well, maybe not so surprisingly, so people are more isolated in their neighborhoods, but they also perceive neighborhoods as safe places. So I'm just going to run through this. This percent indicating no, that they have perceptions of unfair treatment. Most people say legal status, except for Mexicans a little bit here at work, the legal status really isn't an issue for them. Perceptions of saying no for religion. And again, you see some numbers here for blacks and for Indians in public spaces, and Indians a little bit in the neighborhood. But the numbers are still, again, these are overwhelmingly positive numbers. The fraction, there's a small fraction who are encountering some discrimination on the basis of religion, but it's not very big. This is language. Again, the numbers begin to shift. Indians reporting problems with language in public spaces and at work, and Mexicans, again, public spaces and work. But not in the neighborhood, which I think is kind of interesting. This is also interesting because Indians are very residentially integrated in Philadelphia, as they are in Atlanta. Mexicans less so, but that's not where they're reporting perceptions of discrimination on the basis of race or in language. It's not where if there's friction, that's not where it's occurring. And there's a quite large literature in sociology talking about neighborhoods as really the locus for tensions across groups, and that's not what we're finding in these data. It's not neighborhoods. It's more likely to be workplaces and public spaces. And the public spaces part, I think, is quite interesting. So, race, and here you really begin to see some indicators of these. How people are being perceived. It's being perceived by their appearance, obviously. African Americans reporting discrimination in public spaces and work, less so neighborhood. Asian Indians, again, public space and work, and Mexicans at work. And we'll see this again. So this is where it gets really interesting. So Indians are, again, the high status group. But if you look at how they perceive discrimination and how they perceive discrimination by race, they're reporting levels of discrimination that are not that dissimilar from that of African Americans. So they're very high status. They're residentially integrated. They're integrated in workplaces, but they're reporting discrimination at work. And as soon as they step out of work into these public spaces where they have these one-off interactions with people, they're being judged on the basis of race rather than their socioeconomic status. That's my interpretation of what's going on here. that it's really that a lot of this is really taking place in public spaces because these are one-off interactions, and not taking place as much in neighborhoods, because in neighborhoods you know your neighbors, you have these kind of repeated interactions, because people know how to evaluate you. And, whoops, sorry. Mexican immigrants report less discrimination than Indians. Doesn't necessarily mean they actually experience less discrimination, but they're not perceiving it, they're not interpreting it in that way. And there's a sort of growing literature about this as well. About new immigrants in particular, it takes a while for them to sort of figure out that being treated badly isn't just because someone's having a bad day. And so perceiving discrimination is kind of a learned, you have to learn how to interpret it. And we ask this question, by the way, we don't ask about, have you been discriminated? We're asking about unfair treatment, precisely for this reason. So when we're talking about this, we didn't want people to say, I don't know what discrimination means, I don't experience it. So all the questions are about unfair treatment in the workplace, unfair treatment in public spaces. So race is still like this central fact, this central social fact. And you have these perceptions of discrimination, particularly for race and language, which vary across these social spaces. Again, less in the neighborhoods, which I think is very interesting. And the real sort of, interesting thing is that Indians are not that similar from blacks in their reporting of discrimination in public spaces and work. So now we're going to the data that we have for the larger project, and this is for Atlanta and Philadelphia. This is the 2,000 people we did this summer, and this allows us to go beyond the kind of contact questions, the social spaces, the status, to look at how contact shapes trust, and then how trust then shapes civic engagement. So these are the kinds of questions that, I'm a political scientist, I'm more interested in these questions. Not that I'm not interested in the others, but this is more where I'm at. So there's this whole debate, really sparked by Bob Putnam, among others, but really Bob Putnam in his 2007. He had this speech in Sweden where he said, he has this argument, the bowling alone argument, which I'm sure you're probably all familiar with, that sort of civic engagement, civic trust have been declining in the US overall. And then he had this piece from his findings, which he didn't really want to sort of disseminate very broadly, but sort of sitting on it for a while. And then he said, well, I can't hold on to this anymore. I'm going to give this speech. So he gave a speech in Sweden, and the speech said basically, as people come into contact, and particularly under conditions of diversity, the diversity itself sort of accentuates or there's even more disengagement and losses of civic trust in places where there's higher diversity. And he says this is basically about immigration. So immigration is driving sort of lower trust and lower civic engagement. And there are a number of people who have followed up on this and who mostly agree. This is still a very kind of contested area, but it's very much an area, growth area for research. And right, so we're interested in testing this, and so this first set of models, and I'm sparing you the models, but if any of you want to look at models, I have the models. So maybe, I don't know, in the Q&A, if you want to look at regression models, I have them. And so I'm just presenting the results. So this is just the quick and dirty kind of takeaway from these models. So this first set of models is it's contact across the three social spaces: neighborhoods, workplaces, and public spaces. So there are models for each one. These are OLS models. And they basically show blacks and Mexicans to be less trusting than whites. Not so surprising. If you're older and better educated, you're more trusting. And that trust increases with frequency of contact. So this is kind of an interesting finding because So we have lots of different measures of contact. So we have the friendliness of contact, the status of the people that you're interacting with. And again, keep in mind that the contact theory would say that what really matters is that the contact is occurring with people who are of equal status. So this is just a very quick and dirty set of models. I mean, they're very simple. And it's just looking at frequency. And what the results show is just increasing the frequency of contact, regardless of whether the person's low status or high status, whether they're your boss or your employee, that the frequency of contact increases trust. And this is true for all three models. They're all significant. They're all highly significant. And so it's kind of interesting. So then I'm interested in how trust plays out for civic engagement. And so as we expanded the survey, we have lots of questions about different kinds of civic engagement. So I'm going to run through a bunch of them. And keeping in mind that we were interested in these two immigrant groups, there is a voting question, but these civic engagement questions are really not electoral. So they're about participating in neighborhood groups, or joining the PTA, or joining with a community to solve a civic problem. So there are different kinds of questions about non-electoral civic engagement. And so this is a set of logit models. There are 5 variables, different kinds of civic engagement variables in these models. What they show is that blacks are more civically engaged than whites. If it comes to anything with money, the immigrant groups are less likely to be active in those things. Again, that's not that surprising. It's a little bit surprising for the Indian immigrants, but it's not that surprising. Civic engagement increases with age and education. Again, not that surprising. Trust is significant across all the models. And again, strongly significant across all the models. So if you're trusting, you're more likely to be civically engaged. And this is the other kind of interesting finding, is that in all the models, people in Atlanta are more civically engaged than people in Philadelphia, except for union membership. And this kind of surprised me because I was expecting the opposite. So I was thinking, sort of denser city, urban, ward system, strong neighborhoods, all the rest. I think all of this would mean that Philadelphians would be more civically engaged than people in Atlanta. Atlanta, you saw what it looked like. It was like strip mall land. I mean, I don't even know how people engage, how they even see each other. But across every one of these models, Atlantans are more civically engaged than Philadelphians. So if you have any feedback on this, I'd be very interested. So I should actually, can I go back? So I just want to say that in these 5 models, the 5 variables are: participate in a civic group, help organize a civic event, attend a PTA meeting, donate money to a civic organization, and union membership. And then in this part, the 5 models are: donate to a place of worship, donate to charity, come together to solve a common problem, organize an event, and participate in a march. So again, money. The immigrants are less likely to be engaged, but African Americans are more engaged than whites. Civic engagement increases with age. Again, not that surprising. Again, trust is significant across all the models, except participating in a march. And in 3 of the 5 models, Philadelphians are less likely to be engaged than people from Atlanta. And yes, so I think the exceptions are participating in a march. I can't remember what the other one was, but participating in a march was one of them. This, again, a similar kind of model. These are logit models. Yes, logit models. This is just asking blacks, Indians, and Mexicans about their participation in ethnic organizations. And it's about volunteering, donating money, and being attending meetings. I think those the three models. So blacks are more engaged than the 2 immigrant groups. Again, not so surprising. Again, age and education. Trust, again, significant across all the models. And again, Philadelphians, just less engaged. But across all these models, trust is important. And so trust predicts civic engagement. And I don't, thinking about causality and could it be the other way around? I don't see how that goes the other way around. The causal arrow goes in that direction, and so that's interesting. These are ordered logit models on trust and attitudes toward government. This is basically, these are two questions that ask about efficacy. So one of them is are you better off avoiding government? And the other one is asking, do you have no say in government? And basically, so again, blacks feel more efficacious. I mean, again, across all these models, blacks are the most engaged group. Again, age and education. Trust, again, predicts feeling efficacious. And here, the metro area makes no difference. So, so you have this theory, the constrict theory, which would lead you to expect that you should have lower levels of trust and civic engagement, which you have this diversity. And this data doesn't show that at all. So data shows exactly the opposite. So our data seems to, in this very rough and ready way, have pretty strong evidence in support of the contact theory, the original kind of social psychology contact theory. People come into contact, they build up their trust, and that trust then leads to higher levels of civic engagement. That's a sort of pretty straight sort of confirmation of the contact theory, and again, directly contrary to this newer theory, which says the opposite. And then this thing about Philadelphians. Why Philadelphians should be less engaged than Atlantans. So I'm going to throw this out. This is just I have no idea, but I'm going to throw this out. I think it's this. So we did these initial visits to both of these metro areas, and I'm pretty familiar with Philadelphia. My wife's a Philadelphian, so I come here a lot. And so Philadelphia is a metro area with very hard neighborhood boundaries. So if you're African American, you don't go into like the Irish neighborhood. Was it Fishtown or? And if you're whatever. The neighborhood boundaries are fairly hard. And that is not true for Atlanta. I was really, really struck by this in Atlanta, that the neighborhood boundaries, like these suburban areas, people just moving out there. It's like Black, Indian, Mexican, the boundaries in these neighborhoods are very weak because, so in part because the neighborhoods themselves are kind of dispersed, and so I had originally expected that the dispersal, that spatial dispersion would mean less civic engagement. But I actually think that what happens is that spatial dispersion actually translates into kind of greater porousness, and that leads to greater kind of engagement. So again, this is just my sort of talking off the top of my head. I have no idea, but we'll see, because we have lots and lots of data, and this is just sort of getting at the tip of it. So we're going to go back to these two metro areas this coming summer. We're in this process right now of recruiting, hiring. We're almost done with that process. We're going to have sort of 8 graduate research assistants, the PIs, and these 8 wonderful graduate students are all going to go into the field, 4 in each city, and do this kind of field work in these neighborhoods and both of these metro areas. But we're also going to recontact people that we interviewed in the survey and then interview them again. So this is going to be great because we asked people as we were doing the survey, can we talk to you again? And so about 2/3 of the respondents said yes. And so we're kind of thinking about how we're going to do this, where we can do either just a randomized sort of recontact to the people who said they would want to be recontacted, and then do these in-depth interviews with them, where we'll sort of return to these questions about contact and trust and civic engagement, but be able to do it more in depth with each of these respondents. And so the idea is to have, I don't know, probably about 300 interviews for by the end of next summer, where we would have so a lot more sort of in-depth data, and then this kind of neighborhood level observational data as well. So yes, so I don't know. I'm really excited by this next stage as well. So in Philadelphia, this is where we're going to go. So South Philly, where I was taken last night, and Upper Darby, Milbourne. Milbourne is this little. I drove past Milbourne like every time I come to visit Philadelphia, and I never paid any attention to it. It's like this little pocket neighborhood, and it's all Sikhs. Anyway, we're going to go there. If you ever go into Upper Darby, you drive right past it. Norristown. So these are 3 neighborhoods where there actually is some overlap across these 4 groups. Not perfect, because Philadelphia doesn't have a lot of areas where there is a lot of overlap across these groups. But this is as close as you can get. In Atlanta, again, this thing surprised me to no end. In Atlanta, it's actually easier to get overlap across these 4 groups, particularly in this Chambly-Doraville area. Lilburn, it's like this kind of lower middle class suburban neighborhood. Both of these are kind of adjoining that northeast highway that if you drive along it looks like it's like every language in every store just spread along the highway. That's it. So.
We have 25 minutes for questions, and you can take the questions.
Okay. Yeah.
And
yeah.
maybe you could say who you are when you speak up, so Michael knows.
Oh, I'll speak up. Don't have to worry about that. I live in Philadelphia.
Excellent.
I've lived in it in the same neighborhood since I was born 77 years ago. Now I looked at the neighborhood.
Where's the neighborhood?
That you picked out
Yes.
to test Philadelphia. Does anybody in this room live in Philadelphia all their life and are within city boundary now?
Yes.
You've lived in your whole life. What neighborhood are you from? Okay. First of all, Philadelphia isn't one city. Philadelphia is 4 cities. South Philadelphia, West Philadelphia, North Philadelphia, and Northeast Philadelphia. And if you live here, it makes a very big difference. That's one thing. And what does trust mean more specifically? What is trust? Like I'm going to lend you money, or I'm going to be able to call on you to help me if I'm in a problem or something. If my car is broken down. These are some thoughts that go through me. I don't know Atlanta. I visit Atlanta.
Yeah.
And my best friend, in a way, in life is down dead, was from Georgia and was near Atlanta and involved with Atlanta till he came to Philadelphia. And we used to talk about our differences in the way we view life. He was black, Southern, and he was Protestant. And I'm white, Northern, urban, and, quote, Catholic. And we would talk about things and talk about how we view life very differently through those filters. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, your question, it makes me realize that we actually don't ask many questions asking people to define what they think trust means. So there's a lot of questions in that survey asking people about what contact is or where contact occurs, but we don't actually ask them to think much about what trust means, which I now realize is probably a mistake. But there you go. Ahmad.
I'm Ahmad in sociology. Michael, what is the difference between a neighborhood and a public space?
Yes. So there's wording in the items that try and distinguish this, because this came up in our own internal discussions about how we were thinking about this. So I'm going to get the wording wrong a little bit, but when we ask people to talk about their neighborhood, we're talking about where they live and immediately around where they live. And then public spaces are defined a little bit more, so we suggest what public spaces might look like. So restaurants, parks. Again, I'm gonna miss something here, but we were trying to get at different things with neighborhood and public space. Yes.
Yeah, I'm a sociologist. I live in West Philly, and I work a lot with Latino organizations, both on courts and on electoral matters. So I end up working more with the difference. But I have a question about whether you judged how economic competition figures in these perceptions of the groups by one another. Because
yes.
in my experience, blacks can be very directly with Mexicans for certain construction jobs, and especially at different wages. And the other question I'd like to know more about the effect of language, because I speak perfect Spanish with an Argentinian accent, and I can tell you that status doesn't matter one bit for mainly Spanish speakers. If I speak Spanish like now, I'm one of them, that's it. And so I wonder how that figures in other elements of trust. They asked me, you're from Argentina, so I said yes to not replicate.
So there are questions in both the pilot and the full survey that, in fact, they're batteries of questions that get at economic competition and other kinds of competition. So we ask people about, again, how they perceive their neighborhoods changing, how they, so the number of different dimensions we're trying to tap into about how people might feel threatened, and there are several questions about economic threat. So we ask about their own self-assessment of their economic, how things have gone for them economically, and then we ask, again, this battery of questions about economic threat. Now, having said that, this is all to say that we can look at this, and then I have to tell you that I haven't looked at it, but we will. Question about language and trust. So we have some data in the survey, again, about how the respondents' language, but we don't ask, so like the African Americans and native-born whites, we don't ask them whether they speak another language. That was probably another mistake. But that would have been interesting. We don't ask them about what languages they speak. Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Garrett Broad. I'm a postdoc in communication. First of all, thank you very much. I think this is a really great line of research, and I really appreciate pushing this theoretical domain away from a black-white focus into a broader global discussion. I think that's really important and necessary. But first, a quick comment as a native Philadelphian and somebody, I grew up in southern New Jersey, but know Philly a little bit. One thing I think in your interviews you might think about exploring is family ties in particular, and family is a type of civic engagement in this city. I think there's pretty strong family bonds that are often neighborhood focused. There's this gentleman, he's a South Philadelphian, his family's from South Philly, they're South Philly people, right? So there's something I think around that. The other thing too would be sports maybe. You know, I think a lot of Philadelphians consider going to an Eagles game a type of civic engagement, and you know, which gets to a broader question about how are we defining civic engagement, which is really tough, and so you know, and you only have so much space in the types of questions you can ask. But the next question I wanted to ask is really about collapsing ethnicity across geography. And there's a term that I've used in some of my work and scholarship that I work from around geo-ethnicity, the intersection between geography and ethnicity, and how we find very different ways of living among, I did a lot of work in Los Angeles, so for instance among you know, Mexican immigrants living in South Los Angeles as opposed to East Los Angeles. And so in the data that we're looking at combining Atlanta and Philadelphia, we're sort of collapsing all these ethnicities together. And I'm wondering, what are you doing to separate that out and to look for continuity and difference between them, or maybe plans to, as I know this is in an early analytical stage, but thank you.
Those are all great comments. Yeah, family ties. I mean, the reason I keep coming back to Philadelphia is my wife's family is in the area, and yeah, there's a. I mean, I think it's. I'm glad you suggested that, because I think we do need to think about how family plays out. Sports, again, intimately familiar with the importance, the central role that sports play for many Philadelphians. We ask a question which I didn't present the results for participating in sports leagues, but we don't ask about fandom. I don't know whether it didn't occur to us as a kind of civic engagement, but yes, it could be. So geography. These data can be geocoded. So we have the address data and the census tract data, and we can place people more specifically than in just saying South Philly. We can place people, in a very specific way.
Yeah.
So at some point, yeah, we want to come back to this, and I think, yeah, that will be interesting. Yeah, yeah.
I'm Antti Schwenig. I'm the DCC program postdoc this year. So my question is about methods in your data collection. And so I was wondering, when you were talking, you said they were phone interviews, I think, right? So I was wondering if you think that there's some incentive, or if people are more likely to lie about questions that are linked to social desirability. So for me,
Yes.
it came up when you asked about friends. We are friends. And I looked at the category, how many white people said they're black friends. And so I think people would say, well, maybe I should. So you answered that question in a different way, and you might lie about it. And so I was wondering if there is a bias, if you anticipate a bias in the data, data, which way do you think it would go, and for which groups would it go when it comes to trust and certification?
That's also a great question. Yes, so when I first saw the results, I had a similar kind of reaction, particularly for the white respondents. So I don't think that the immigrant respondents are censoring themselves in quite the same way, or the African American respondents. I really think that it's most likely the white respondents, and particularly when they're talking about how trusting they are, and whites are like, of course I trust people, and I look at that data and I go, I don't believe this. So I take that with a bit of a grain of salt, and I think we can come back to this in these longer interviews. Yeah, I don't really have much to say about that, except to say that I simply, I share this. Yeah.
Actually, and I have another question to make. Sorry. When you talk about civic engagement, do you ask questions about language skills, and what do you think the relationship is between how well you speak English and how civically engaged you can be, and how that might prohibit you from being engaged?
That's a good suggestion. So we do ask people for their self-evaluation of language, both in their, in English, if they're non-English speakers. So that's also something we should pay attention to. Yeah. Yeah.
Interviews conducted in multiple languages?
The interviews were conducted in Spanish and English. So again, we had this long discussion about the South Asian, but it gets really complicated. So the South Asian population, I've done some of the breakdowns. We asked people about their home state in India, if they're from India, and so there are about 30 plus different states that people come from, and the top about 10 where there are large clusters of people. And of course, they have their own languages, and so it was just impossible. Yeah, so they're in English, much to our regret. Yes.
Hi, I'm Lauren Thomas from Rutgers, historian. I wonder, did you ask people about length of residence?
Yes.
And what will you do with that information? It strikes me that it might have a similar impact to that idea of geoethnicity, just kind of one of those determinants that's really sort of hard to measure in some way, but I'm just curious how you interpret that.
Yep. So So the short answer is that we have that data. So we ask people about year of entry. We have, but every time I, get these, give these talks and get these questions, I realize should have asked that. So for the native born, we don't ask about how long they've lived in Philadelphia or Atlanta, and we should have. Oh well. So we will when we can do these longer interviews. But we do have the data. We do have that for the foreign born, and yeah. So it's interesting. There's a fairly sizable number of people who give no response to some of those questions. So a fairly large number of people who don't answer their age question, which kind of surprised me a bit. Then we asked for an age range, and some people answered that. But there's still a number of people who refuse to give any age at all, and so that matters because when you're trying to calculate what percentage of their life have they spent in the U.S., you need to have their age. So you have to figure this out. We'll probably impute ages. Yeah. Yes.
Robert, I'm a doc student at GSC. I had a question similarly, which is questions around documentation status.
Yes.
And understandably why people may not respond to that on the phone,
yeah.
But how that might play into something like civic participation.
Yeah. So again, these models don't include that. As we complicate them, they will. But we do ask. We had a substantial, long conversation about how to ask about legal status, and we're actually very blunt about it. So we ask about what kinds of papers they had when they entered the country and what they have now. And so we ended up asking it bluntly, in part because I've done now a number of these surveys, and I've asked it a number of different ways. So some will try to be subtle, some where we're more direct, and it turns out that asking directly is pretty successful. The people do respond to just a direct question about what kinds of papers they have. There's a percentage of people who don't answer, but it's a relatively small percentage, smaller than you would think. When I was first thinking about this, I thought, half the people will say they don't know or don't want to answer, and it's more like 10%.
Isn't that a measure of trust?
I don't know what that's a measure of. I mean, I'm every time I get those results, I'm a little shocked that people are willing to give that information out. I'm curious. Yes.
Do you see a difference in church attendance rates between Atlanta and Philadelphia? Because I was wondering if maybe that could explain the difference in civic participation amongst blacks and other groups.
Again, great suggestion. Haven't done it. I can do that this afternoon.
Following up on that, do you see a difference in the center of social interactions in Atlanta as opposed to Philadelphia? Because I would assume Atlanta church is incredibly important, and I wonder if it's as important in Philadelphia as it is in Atlanta, and if it isn't,
right,
what winds up being the center here as opposed to Atlanta?
Church is important everywhere.
Equally so.
Again, I haven't looked at the difference between Atlanta and Philadelphia, but just speaking from other surveys that I've run and looking at different groups, it's the number one way that people engage civically, by far. By orders of magnitude. So any of these other things like participate in an ethnic group or those things are maybe 1 in 10, 1 in 8, whereas church is 60-70% saying they are involved with their church. This is across ethnic groups, but particularly for African Americans. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Latins from the Social Science and Policy. Thinking more about religious participation, I think it might complicate the amount of money that migrants get. I mean, I don't know if you guys asked specifically, did you just ask, do you give money to nonprofit, or if they responded no, do you give money elsewhere? Because I think that may also provide more insight to where they're directing money if they're donating money at all.
Like remittances?
No, not remittances. For example, they might not donate to a neighborhood organization, but they may contribute to neighborhood programs within their church.
Okay.
I mean, I just keep thinking back about the photograph that you showed.
Yeah.
I mean, that's extremely extravagant, and I mean, a lot of money had to go into that. So
Yes.
are they directing their funds elsewhere, or are they just keeping them for
Yeah.
personal use?
Yeah, if you're ever in Atlanta, you should go to that place. We do ask about donations to place of worship, donation to charity, and donation to an ethnic group. And in all of those cases, the immigrant respondents report less.
Okay, so it's consistently low across.
Yeah, it's lower than that for African Americans, for instance. Yeah.
Amanda Bergson-Chilcock from the Welcoming Center for New Pennsylvanians. I have to thank Penn for letting a non-academic sneak in here. I will be very quick because I have a couple questions. One is about the diversity of your interviewers. You mentioned that you did interviews in English and Spanish, but I'm wondering, did you have African American interviewers? Were they all white? One is about controlling for income. Montgomery County is very wealthy. Philadelphia is one of the highest poverty big cities in the country. The differences between Philadelphia and Atlanta, so I'm sort of curious as to what degree you were able to control for income. And then around African American civic engagement, I did a lot of work last year on voter ID, and I'm wondering whether you have any hypothesis about whether the relatively high levels of African American civic engagement have anything to do with sort of a history of needing to be civically engaged around things like voter ID or civil rights. And then lastly, I would just say an observation, which is, as a lifelong Phillies fan, with a team that really has a terrible record as far as African Americans, last team in baseball to integrate, it's amazing to see the growth of Latino fans in the last 10 years. So I'll just
Interesting.
stop there.
Well, we should have asked about fan engagement. The last thing about blacks being more engaged because of the history, I think is almost surely true. We can't actually capture that with what we're asking, at least in this set of questions, but maybe in the follow-ups. Income, we do ask about income. This is a perennial survey problem. So you ask people about income, and people don't like talking about income. So we then ask, well, tell us a range. Is it more than 20,000? Is it like, so we go through this, like, the interviews spend a lot of time trying to like nudge people to telling them, about something about their money that they earn. And still, after all of that, we have a third of respondents who don't give any income data. And I'm not sure how we're going to deal with that. Maybe, again, imputation. Interviewers, so they're native Spanish speakers and native English speakers, and I don't know exactly what the breakdown is of African Americans and whites who are doing these phone interviews. I could probably ask, but.
Just thinking, going back to that question about trust,
Yeah.
and whether you disclose about your migration status or anything else,
Yeah.
based on the voice of the interviewer on the phone.
Yeah, when we do these longer follow-ups, we are doing co-ethnic interviewing, so that's something we were very concerned about. Yes.
I'm Julia from criminology. I was wondering how you thought about if people who take the survey might be more trusting than people who would just take
Yeah.
up on you.
Yes.
And how you would deal with that kind of stuff.
We can't.
Like what percent just hung up?
A lot. I don't think that there are differences across the metro areas, but so there's several. It's about surveying. So I didn't start off as a survey person. I started off as an ethnographer. So I've now learned a lot about surveys, much more than I ever wanted to know. So response rates in general have like plummeted for surveys. So you're now getting 10% response rates. I think our response rates are in that ballpark for 10%. So like 9 out of 10 people are hanging up. And then there's another complication. Another complication is cell phones. So this turns out to be enormously complicated when we're trying to do a survey that's Atlanta specific and Philadelphia specific. So it's fine in a national survey because you just randomly dial and you get some cell phone numbers, and it doesn't matter whether you're calling in an LA number and they're living in Philadelphia. But it does matter if what you really care about is that people are living in Philadelphia. This ended up being enormously complicated for us because so the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has the best data on the percentage of households that are now cell phone only. And as of like 2 years ago, it was like 30% of households are cell-phone only. It's higher for minorities, African Americans, and Latinos. It's like 40% plus. This is like 2 years ago. And that number is changing every year by like 5–10%. So I mean, it's like we're probably now close to almost half of households being cell phone only. And the survey firms are dealing with this badly. So again, national surveys, it's easier. These local surveys, it's just a nightmare. Yeah, I'm not 100% confident that we actually captured that. So bias in the sample, probably. Yeah, yeah. Yes?
Do you have any perspective on differences in either methodology or findings that explain why you find essentially the opposite of Putnam and some of the other?
I think they're wrong. So I will say this about...
Did you hear the question about
No.
Can you repeat it, Michael? Can you just...
So why we have different results from Putnam at all. So this also gets to methodology. So Putnam's results are based on a set of surveys that were done in different localities around the U.S. In 2000. I can't remember exactly what the date was. And so it was an odd survey. These were the towns that participated in the survey opted in. So it was like, I don't know how he did it. He had like some kind of call and said, if we're doing the survey, if you want to participate, kick in some money and we'll interview you in Lawrence, Kansas. So the group of towns, he has a lot of towns that bought into this, but they're an odd collection of towns. And then at the time that they were doing this, they were really interested in sort of civic engagement and a little bit in race. They asked almost nothing about immigration. So immigration was kind of off the radar for them. And it's only kind of in the reanalysis of the data that Putnam went, there's something going on here with immigration. And so there's some odd things about the way that survey project was designed and the absence of data to allow him to really get a hold of the kinds of questions that we're trying to address here. So I think that that's partly what's going on, is that, there are odd things with that survey. But it clearly has some traction, so there are people who are following up on this, and it's become part of the debate, and I think kind of a pernicious part of the debate. And I think Putnam, to his credit, realized this when he was talking about it. He knew this was going to be somewhat explosive. Didn't stop him. But anyway, yes. Yes.
Susan Seifert at Penn Social Policy and Practice, and we do research on social impact of the arts. And I would just like to say that our findings support your direction of findings.
Excellent. I like hearing that.
Putnam seems to be a detour. And I guess the other thing that we found, which might be of interest around the Philadelphia Atlantic thing, is we keep seeing we've been looking at social connections as an aspect of well-being, and we always start with cultural engagement, but we see this distinction among Philadelphia neighborhoods between face-to-face interaction versus these institutional connections. And my guess is your civic engagement is picking up more institutional connections, which tends to be an organizational affiliation. And that we also, this community engagement versus civic engagement, Philadelphians, and I think the neighborhood spatial, the porousness, I think the urbanity of Philadelphians increases the informal interaction of the family and neighbor and sports type, and less necessarily formal affiliation. I'm just saying that we actually can see differences, and that it is sort of class, that more prosperous people tend to be more connected institutionally than the face-to-face. Anyway, it's just, we're at an early stage too in this particular thing, but I just wanted to mention that there's sort of some interesting things.
In this study, we're thinking of this kind of face-to-face contact as an independent variable that predicts trust. But what you're suggesting is maybe we want to think about that kind of face-to-face contact as a dependent variable that, yes. we might be able to do this, and I should look at it. Yeah.
I'd love it if you did.
Yeah.
Because then I'll
Yeah.
call you and ask you.
Yeah.
Well, suggesting directions for future projects and collaborations is always a good way to wrap up a presentation. So I want to thank Michael. And also thank you for coming and for your questions. And again, I'll encourage you, there is a sign-up sheet if you want to get on our mailing list. You can also go to the Social Science and Policy Forum webpage. And you can also find us on Facebook. Please, we have a very exciting series of events on immigration over the course of the rest of the year. Please check it out and come. The next one again will be the first and second weeks of December, the 6th and 13th of December. Anya Ramazayas, who's actually going to have interesting connections to Michael's talk today, looking at immigrants learning race, and then Demetrius Papadimitriou on immigration policy. Thank you all for coming again.
Thank you.
I'm interested in your books about Latinos. I'm on